Okay, welcome back. We're going to go through the endocrine system. Let's start off with hormone types. So there's three types of hormones. Protein/peptides based hormones. These are water soluble. Okay? And the difference between a protein and peptide, think about it as proteins are usually bigger than 100 amino acids. And there's the main ones are insulin, released from the pancreas. These are the main protein-based. Insulin, glucagon, and then you've got your pituitary, right? You've got your anterior, you've got your posterior. Okay, that release hormones. Second type is steroid hormones. Okay, these are lipid soluble. And they're usually cholesterol based. And these, in order to travel through carriers. These carriers are globulin, and albumin. Okay, those are the two carriers. And the steroid hormones is the ones released from the adrenal cortex. There's also some release from the testes, like testosterone. There's also some release from the ovaries. Okay, progesterone, estrogen. Okay, now let's break down the adrenal cortex, right? We've got the adrenal gland, and there is 4 types of sections of this, okay? So you got the glomerulosa, you got the fasciculata, you got the reticularis, and you got the medulla. Okay, but only these 3 are part of the cortex. Okay, and they all release their own hormones. Okay, let's start with the glomerulosa. Okay, this releases mineralocorticoids. These mineralocorticoids, an example is aldosterone. Mineral controls minerals, right? Aldosterone acts on a nephron, which is the main functional unit of the kidneys, to reabsorb sodium. And wherever sodium goes, water follows. Okay. Next one is fasciculata, which causes the release of glucocorticoids. Okay, and glucocorticoids control glucose levels, right? An example is cortisol, that's released from the adrenal gland. And then you've got the reticularis, which controls androgens, right? Androgens such as like sex hormones, right? Okay, gone through steroid hormones. Let's move on to the last one is amino-based hormones. Okay, specifically tyrosine. Okay, an example of this is T3, T4, right? However, these are water-based, usually. However, T3, T4 is an exception, as you'll see later on. They have iodine residues. These iodine residues make them lipid soluble. Okay, so you've got the amino acid based, and it's an example is released from the medulla of the adrenal gland, which is it releases 2: adrenaline and noradrenaline. These are both amino acid based. Okay, these are the 3 types. Sorry about that. These are the 3 types. You've got steroid, protein peptides, amino acid based. Okay, let's move on to the mechanism of action. Okay, we've got a cell. Okay, the first one we're going to go through is protein/peptides. We said protein/peptides before H2O, remember? Okay, and we've got the phospholipid bilayer. Now, water soluble can't cross the phospholipid barrier. So in order to get into the cell, the hormone, and trigger an action in that cell, it must bind to something first and trigger other actions because it can't directly get in and do it itself. So it binds to a membrane receptor. Okay, and this membrane receptor, once it's bound, it triggers secondary messengers. Okay, these secondary messengers could be like calcium, they could be cyclic AMP, right, and others. These secondary messengers amplify the signal and transmit, and can trigger transcription translation factors within the nucleus I'm going to draw now. Okay. So steroid hormones, as we said before, is the next one, which is lipid-based, which means it can cross and get into the cell. But this time it binds to cytoplasmic receptors. Okay. And that triggers transcription and translation factors. Next is amino acid base. Now, amino acid base we said is water soluble, so it has to bind to membrane receptors. However, I did say there's an exception. The exception is T3, T4. T3, T4 are actually lipid based. The reason why they're lipid based is because they have iodine residues. And because it's lipid based, it's able to go within the cell and directly go into the nucleus and bind to nuclear receptors and trigger transcription translation factors. Okay, so those are the three ways these three types of hormones can act on the cell, right? Protein peptides, water soluble, so it can't get into the cell. It must bind to a membrane receptor first, then go through secondary messengers and amplify and transmit the signal. Steroid based, which is lipid soluble, so it can get in the cell, bind to cytoplasmic receptors, which is just receptors within the cytoplasm, and that can act and do like transcription translation, right? Act on that. And then you've got amino acid base, which are usually water soluble, so they bind to the membrane receptor. However, there is one exception you should know, T3, T4, which is a thyroid hormone, which didn't go through because it's lipid soluble, because it has iodine residues, go into the cell, go into the nucleus, bind to a nuclear receptors, and activate transcription translation factors. Okay? That's done for that one. Let's go to control of secretion. So the three ways of control of secretion. Okay. Sorry. Let me just go back. I'm going to quickly do something first before I forget. Sorry about that. I forgot to differentiate between endocrine and neuron. Right? So the endocrine system is slow, it's long-acting, it's indirect because it uses hormones, right? These act as the chemical messengers, the hormones. Whereas you've got neurons. Neurons are fast, short-acting, direct, and the messenger acts as the neurotransmitters. Okay, let's go back to control of secretion. Okay, three types, right? Neural, hormonal, humoral. Okay, let's start with neural. So neural, as it says, a neuron is actually with the axon terminal of that neuron is within that target tissue, and it can actually trigger the release of hormone from that target tissue. And I'm giving an example of the adrenal medulla. So a neuron travels down the axon, it transmits a signal to the adrenal medulla and triggers the release of a hormone. An example is adrenaline that's released from the adrenal medulla. So the neuron directly acts on that target tissue. Where if you go something that's hormonal, right? Hormonal, a cell releases a hormone. That hormone travels through the bloodstream and acts on another cell. This cell has a receptor that the hormone binds to that receptor and triggers an action, right? Now we've got humoral. Humoral's a little bit different, okay? It's a little bit because we don't use hormones, but we use something else to act for that. We use nutrients or minerals, right? Nutrients or minerals could be, let's say, sodium. These sodium, think of it, they act as the hormone, right? They act as the chemical messenger. They go in the bloodstream, they travel to that target cell that has a receptor on it, and it binds to it. And once it binds to it, it triggers the release of the hormone. Okay? So the nutrients or minerals act as that. Okay? Let's go to our next one. There's 3 types. Let me just summarize. So this can release hormones, right? Also, the humoral can also release hormones, but the main